Picture a linen closet the size of a small church, shelves rising higher than a man can reach, every shelf stacked with sheets so white they look blue in the candlelight. Now fill it with 3,000 chemises, 44 dozen pillowcases, bed linens embroidered with crowns that will be unpicked and burned within 4 years. Add the smell of hot starch and lye soap, the ache of forearms that have wrung wet cloth since before dawn, and a queen upstairs who will change her chemise twice a day whether it needs changing or not, because that is what queens do, while you have exactly 2 chemises to your own name and wear one while you wash the other. That's Versailles, and then Paris, and then a stone cell with no window worth the name, magnificent above, merciless below, a place where you could iron a nightgown worth more than your family's farm in the morning, and watch that same nightgown burned as evidence of treason 4 years later. We're going back there tonight, not as tourists gawking at a palace-turned museum, not as people who already know how the story ends and can watch it from a safe distance. We're living it from underneath. 1 laundress, 1 set of hands, 1 queen's rooms, and everything that passed through them before the taking, during the taking, and after. The things nobody wrote down because nobody thought a girl who washed sheets was worth asking. I make these history stories and I still don't know if anyone actually sleeps to them, or if you're all just people who like falling asleep to the sound of a monarchy coming apart at the seams. Either way, get comfortable. This one runs long because her rooms held more than anyone admitted for a very long time. Here we go. Your hands are in the water before your eyes are properly open. That's the first thing about the garde-linge, the linen room of the Queen's household at Versailles, and later at the Tuileries. The water doesn't wait for you to wake up. It's already boiling in the great copper vessel by the time you arrive, already thick with lye and the grey scum that rises off 3 days of washing, and your hands go in anyway, because Madame Eloff, who runs the room with a grip like a bailiff, has no patience for workers who flinch. You are 20 years old the first time you're handed a queen's chemise and told to get the wine stain out of it without ruining the lace. Your name is Elise Mourier. You came to Versailles at 18 from a village near Rouen where your father makes cider and your mother is dead, and an aunt who works in the royal kitchens got you a place in the linen room because your hands were well suited to delicate work and your back was strong enough for the heavy lifting nobody else wanted to do. You have been here 2 years now. You still flinch sometimes. You've learned to do it where Madame Eloff can't see. The journey from Normandy took 4 days by cart, and you spent most of it curled against a sack of your own belongings. 2 shifts, a comb, a small wooden cross your mother left you, and a heel of bread your father pressed into your hands at the last moment without quite meeting your eyes, because he was not a man who knew how to say goodbye any other way. You remember the smell of the cart, damp hay and horse sweat, and the particular ache that settled into your hip bones from sitting on hardboards for 4 days straight. An ache you didn't fully understand until years later was simply the ordinary cost of being poor and having to travel anyway. You remember arriving at Versailles at dusk, and how the palace, lit along its whole enormous front with what seemed like 1,000 candles, looked less like a building and more like something that had fallen out of the sky and was still faintly glowing from the fall. You had never in your life seen so much light spent on nothing more urgent than being seen. Your aunt met you at the servants' gate, a narrow, unglamorous door around the side that no visitor to the palace would ever be shown, and walked you through corridors that grew progressively plainer and narrower the further you went from the staterooms, until you reached a stairwell so tight 2 people could not pass each other on it without turning sideways, and climbed it to a garret room under the roof where 11 straw mattresses lay in 2 crowded rows, and the ceiling sloped so low you could only stand fully upright in the exact centre of the room. This was to be your home. You cried the first night, quietly, into a mattress that smelled of other girls' hair oil and years of accumulated exhaustion, and told yourself you would stop crying by morning. And mostly you did, because there is very little use in a linen room for a girl who cannot stop. The chemise in your hands is finer than anything you have ever owned or ever will own. Cambric so fine you can nearly see your fingers through it, trimmed with Alençon lace that took some other girl, somewhere in Normandy, an entire winter to make by candlelight. Her eyes ruining themselves stitch by stitch for a garment she will never see worn, and never be told was worn by anyone at all. You know this because your own grandmother did lacework before her sight failed. You think about her every time you touch lace this fine. You think about her hands, and then you look at your own hands, red and cracked from lye, and you understand something about the world that nobody has to explain to you twice. The wine stain is old, days old, gone brown at the edges, and you know already that it will take an hour of careful work with lemon juice and salt and patience, thinner than the cambric itself. If you tear the fabric getting the stain out, it comes from your wages. If you fail to get the stain out at all, Madame Eloff will not dock your wages. She'll simply look at you in a way that makes you wish she had. This is not fair, and you are 15 years old, and nobody has ever once asked you whether you think it's fair. The Queen changes her chemise on average twice a day, sometimes 3 times if she's been riding, or if the day is hot, or if she simply feels like it. Each chemise, once removed, comes down to your room to be washed, starched, ironed, and returned within 48 hours, because the Queen's household maintains an inventory of linens that would clothe a small town, and every piece of it must always be ready, always white, always without a single mark of the human body that actually wore it. You have never once seen the Queen in person. Not really. You have seen her from a distance, across a courtyard, a small bright figure surrounded by a moving wall of silk and feathers, and you have handled the intimate cloth of her body more times than you can count, without ever once being permitted to look directly at her face if she happens to pass within 20 feet of you. Servants look down. This is the rule, and you learned it in your first week, the hard way, when you glanced up out of simple curiosity as a duchess swept past and a steward's hand landed on the back of your neck hard enough to leave a mark. You are invisible. That is the actual job, not laundress. Invisible. But you know things about her that the duchesses do not know. You know that she bites the inside of her cheek when she's anxious, because you find the small tears in the linen near her mouth where her teeth have worried at fabric she's pulled up without realizing. You know she sweats more than the portraits would ever suggest, because you know the particular smell of her. Orange blossom water over something warmer and more human underneath. A smell you'd recognize blind in a room of 100 women. You know when she has been crying, because tears leave their own mark on cambric, different from sweat. And in the autumn of 1785, after the whole miserable business with the diamond necklace that wasn't even hers, you find that mark on nearly every chemise that comes down to your room for 3 straight weeks. Nobody asks the laundress if the Queen has been well. Nobody would think to. But you know. You always know. Her linens tell you everything the court gossip only guesses at. Versailles itself, you learn in your first year, is not one world, but a stack of worlds, each one invisible to the one above it and barely tolerated by the one below. Above you, The court proper. Dukes and marquises and their wives, thousands of them, competing for a glance from the king with the same desperate arithmetic you once watched two farm boys back home compete for the attention of the miller's daughter. Below the court, but still within the walls, the vast machinery of people who actually keep the palace running. Cooks, grooms, gardeners, chimney sweeps, candle trimmers, whose entire working life is spent ensuring that no single wick anywhere in the building ever burns down to a stub in front of someone important. And below even that, in a category so far beneath notice that most of the court doesn't know it exists at all, the town of Versailles itself, grown up around the palace's back gate like a barnacle on a ship's hull, full of the tradesmen and washerwomen and unlicensed peddlers who service the servants, who service the nobility, who service the king. You go into that town perhaps once a month, on your half day, to buy thread or soap or simply to breathe air that doesn't smell of lye, and you find it a strange, upside-down mirror of the palace above it. The same hierarchies, the same small cruelties of rank, scaled down to fit people with almost nothing, arguing over almost nothing, with the same intensity the duchesses bring to arguing over precedence at a formal dinner. A washerwoman in the town once told you, over a shared cup of watered wine at market stall, that the whole of France was built the same way, floor after floor of people looking down on the floor below them and never once looking up. And you have thought about that sentence more times in your life than you would ever admit to her if you saw her again. The Garde-Langue itself is a world unto itself. A long low room with high windows that never quite let in enough light, lined with presses of dark wood, the great ironing tables scarred pale from decades of hot irons dragged across their surfaces. In summer, the room is an oven. The fires under the boiling coppers never go out, and by midday you can wring the sweat from your own shift the same way you wring water from the Queen's sheets. In winter, your hands crack and bleed from the lye and the cold both, and Madame Eloff hands out a pot of tallow grease every few days that you rub into your knuckles at night, and it helps a little, and it smells like a butcher's shop, and you sleep in a room with 11 other girls where the smell of tallow and lye and unwashed wool hangs so thick you stop noticing it after the first month. Madame Eloff catches you once in your first winter staring at your own split knuckles with an expression she apparently recognises, because she takes your hand without asking permission, turns it over in the candlelight and says, not unkindly, that hands like yours are the only honest thing in the whole palace. Every lady up there, she says, tilting her head toward the ceiling and the staterooms above it, spends a fortune on creams to hide what her hands actually do, which is generally nothing at all. Yours will always tell the truth. That's not a curse, girl. Whatever you think tonight, a hand that's done real work is a hand you can trust. Remember that when you're old and it aches. You didn't understand her fully that night. You've understood her better with every year since. There is another rule Madame Eloff teaches you that first winter, delivered with the same flat, unsentimental certainty. Never let a fine lady see you flinch, whatever she says to you, however she says it. They are testing you, she says, not maliciously, most of them, simply out of habit, the way a child pokes at an ant to see if it moves. The moment they see you flinch, you become a person to them, someone with feelings that can be provoked, and a person is more interesting to torment than a piece of furniture. Stay furniture. Furniture gets left alone. You have kept that rule for years. It has served you better than almost anything else you were ever taught in that room. You learn the hierarchy of fabric the way other girls your age might learn the hierarchy of saints. Linen for everyday use, cheaper, coarser, washed hot and hard. Cambric for anything that touches the queen's skin directly, washed gentler, dried away from direct sun so it doesn't yellow. Lace handled separately entirely, in cold water with the barest touch of soap. Laid flat to dry on frames stretched with muslin, pinned into shape while still damp so it dries into its pattern rather than a wrinkled mess. Damask and brocade never washed at all, only brushed and aired, because water would kill the sheen that took a lion workshop 8 months to weave. You learn to read a garment's age by its wear. You learn which of the Queen's ladies borrow her linens without permission and return them slightly altered. A seam let out here, a lace edge trimmed there, hoping nobody in the guardling will notice. You always notice. You never say anything, because saying something means being noticed yourself, and being noticed in this house is rarely to a servant's advantage. The Queen herself, you are told by an older girl named Berthe, who's been in the linen room 6 years and has opinions about everything, used to be kinder than she is now. Used to visit the Gardling herself sometimes in the early years, curious about the fabrics, asking questions about the lace patterns the way a girl who genuinely liked pretty things might ask. That was before the pamphlet started, before the whole country decided that every ribbon she wore and every diamond at her throat was a personal theft from a hungry child in Lyon, which, Berthe says, lowering her voice even though there's nobody in the room to hear, might not even be entirely wrong, though it isn't entirely her fault either. Somebody has to wear the crown's clothes. It might as well be the one born to it. You privately think the Austrian marriage was doomed the day it happened, though you would never say this where a soul could hear it. A foreign queen arrives at 14, is stripped of her Austrian gowns at the border and dressed in French ones before she's even allowed a cross, is expected to produce an heir immediately, and doesn't manage it for 7 years, and every single day of those 7 years, the entire court and half the pamphleteers of Paris speculate in exquisite, cruel detail about exactly why. You know things about the royal bed-sheets too, you've washed those. You'll say nothing further about that except that 7 years is a long time to have your most private failures discussed over dinner tables you will never sit at. By the time you're 17, in 1789, the pamphlets have gotten worse, and they've started reaching even the linen room. A footman brings one in, folded small, passed hand to hand among the staff with a kind of guilty hunger. Everyone wants to read it. Everyone is little ashamed of wanting to. It calls the Queen things you won't repeat, accuses her of things you have no way of knowing whether are true, though you doubt most of it, because you have handled her most private linens for 4 years, and you know a woman's habits better through her laundry than any pamphleteer knows them through rumour. But you also know that none of that matters anymore. The pamphlets aren't really about the Queen, they're about the price of bread. She has simply become the shape that everyone's hunger has decided to take. There is a room below the kitchens, unofficial, unnamed, where the household staff gather in the evenings after the last fires are banked and the last dishes scrubbed, and it becomes, over the years leading up to 1789, something like the servant's own coffee house. Not coffee, which none of you can afford, but small beer and whatever bread is going stale enough to be given away rather than served, and above all news. A footman who has been to Paris on an errand brings back 3 days of gossip at once. A groom who drove a minister's carriage repeats, half remembered and probably half invented, whatever he overheard through the carriage window. You learn to sift truth from exaggeration the way you learn to sift a genuine stain from a fabric floor. By handling enough of both, that you eventually develop a feel for the difference. It's in that room, on a spring evening in 1789, that you first hear the word that will define the rest of your life without your understanding it yet: Estates General. An assembly, someone explains, the first in over a century and a half, summoned because the crown has run out of money in a way that can no longer be patched over by clever accounting, and every class in France, nobles, clergy, and everyone else, the vast everyone else that includes both you and your father back in Normandy, is to send representatives to argue about how the whole broken machine ought to be fixed. Nobody in that basement room believes, in the spring of 1789, that anything will actually change. You have all heard promises of reform before. But there is a different quality to the talk that spring, a kind of held breath running underneath the usual grumbling, as though even the most cynical among you can feel something shifting that hasn't shifted before. By June, word reaches even the linen room that the representatives of the common estate have refused to be dismissed, have sworn some kind of oath to keep meeting until France has a constitution worth the name, and Berthe, who has opinions about everything, declares over the washing tubs that this is either the best thing that has ever happened to people like you, or the beginning of something that will get a great many people killed, and possibly both at once. She turns out, over the following 4 years, to have been entirely right on both counts. That summer, the summer of 1789, everything you have known your whole short working life begins to come apart, though it takes months for you to understand how completely. The news comes to Versailles in pieces, carried by footmen and stable boys who hear things in town, and the pieces don't fit together properly at first. A prison stormed in Paris, a crowd, some kind of massacre or some kind of liberation depending on who's telling it. You don't fully understand what a Bastille is or why anyone would care that it's fallen, until Berthe explains, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has always suspected the world was about to turn upside down, that it means the king no longer commands the kind of fear that keeps a country obedient. Fear, you think, working a stain out of a fichu with your thumbnail, is not something you've ever noticed the king commanding in the first place. But you keep that thought where thoughts like that belong, which is nowhere anyone can hear them. By October, the crowd comes to Versailles itself. You hear it before you see anything. A sound like weather, like a storm rolling in from a great distance. Except storms don't shout. Thousands of women, market women mostly, half of Paris on foot in the rain, walking 12 miles because there was no bread in the city, and they had decided collectively, in the particular fury of people who have run out of patience along with flour, that they would go and ask the king about it directly. Madame Eloff locks the linen room doors that evening, which she's never once done before, not in all your years there, and the 11 of you sit on the floor between the ironing tables listening to a noise from outside that none of you have words for. Not quite a riot, not quite a battle. Something in between, made of thousands of individual furies all pointed in the same direction at once. In the morning, you learn what happened in the night, in pieces, the way you learn everything. A stable boy's account, contradicted by a footman's account, contradicted again by what a scullery girl overheard from a guardsman who was actually there. Somebody breached the palace itself in the small hours. 2 of the royal guards, men whose faces you might have half recognized from years of them standing at doors you were never permitted to enter, are dead, their heads taken as trophies and carried back toward Paris on pikes, because that is apparently a thing that happens now. In this world you are only just beginning to understand you're living in. The royal family, you're told, will be brought to Paris, not as guests, as a condition. The crowd wants its king close enough to watch, close enough to make sure he doesn't disappear back into the comfortable remoteness of Versailles while Paris starves. And here is the part that concerns you directly, the part that actually changes your life rather than simply frightening it. The household is moving too. Not all of it. Versailles will keep a skeleton staff for the buildings themselves, but the linens go where the queen goes, because a queen without proper linen is apparently a crisis on the same order as a queen without bread. And you, Elise Mourier, 17 years old, daughter of a Norman cider maker, are going to Paris. You have never been to Paris. You have heard about it your whole life the way you might hear about the moon. A fact, distant, unrelated to anything you'd actually touch. Now you are riding in the back of a cart loaded with chests of linen, jolting along a road crowded with the retreating remains of the mob that walked out from the city the day before. Some of them singing, some of them silent and exhausted, all of them somehow triumphant in a way that makes the back of your neck prickle. The Tuileries Palace, when you arrive, is nothing like Versailles. Versailles was built to be looked at from a distance. All gold and symmetry and gardens stretching to a horizon, designed to make you feel the smallness of your own life. The Tuileries is older, darker, built up over centuries by kings who didn't especially want to live there. A palace that had mostly stood empty and neglected for decades before the royal family arrived in it, as essentially prisoners with excellent furniture. Your first task in the new Gare Linge, smaller, colder, with windows that look out not on manicured gardens but directly onto a public garden full of ordinary Parisians who have taken to strolling past the palace specifically to see if they can catch a glimpse of their captured king, is to unpack chests of linen that were folded in haste and packed in a hurry, and now need to be aired, checked for mildew, and pressed all over again. It takes you and Bertha and 6 other girls the better part of 2 weeks. The Queen, you learn quickly, has changed, not just in circumstance, in herself. The woman whose linens told you about her small human failures at Versailles, the sweat, the tears, the bitten cheek, is still recognizable in her laundry. But there's something new now too. A kind of held-still tension that runs through everything. Fabric that comes down from her rooms sometimes smells faintly of something you can't quite name, something you eventually decide is simply fear, sustained fear, the kind that seeps into skin over months rather than arriving all at once. You've smelled fear before, on your own skin, in the small hours of the mob outside Versailles. You recognize it now on hers. Sourcing the materials the Gare Linge needs becomes, in these Tuileries years, a task far more complicated than it ever was at Versailles, where merchants came directly to the palace and competed for the honour of supplying the crown. In Paris, with the treasury strained and half the old suppliers either fled abroad or quietly refusing further credit, to a household whose future looks less certain every season, you are sent, more than once, into the markets around Les Halles yourself to negotiate directly for soap, lye, starch, and the fine soft soap used specifically on lace, haggling in the same close practical way you once watched apprentices haggle over ribbon on a busy trading street. Except now, the stakes are not a shopkeeper's profit margin, but whether the Queen's linens can be properly maintained at all on a budget that shrinks every quarter. You learn the going rate for a pound of good Marseille soap, and the going rate for the cheaper, harsher soap cut with tallow and ash that leaves a residue in fine linen if you're not careful to rinse 3 times instead of 2. You learn which merchant will extend credit to the royal household even now, out of a stubborn, old-fashioned loyalty that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with 40 years of his family supplying the crown, and which merchants have quietly decided that continued association with the palace is no longer worth the risk to their own custom, whatever they still owe in unpaid invoices. Half in coin, half on account, same as always, you tell one particularly stubborn supplier on a cold morning in 1791, holding his gaze the way Madame Eloff taught you to hold a duchess's gaze without flinching, and he grumbles and takes the money and hands over the soap, because a girl who doesn't flinch is in the end easier to simply agree with than to keep arguing against. She still dresses with the same care, still demands linens pressed to the same exacting standard. If anything, she's more particular now than she was before, and you understand this too in your own quiet way, because you have noticed the same thing in yourself. When everything outside your control is collapsing, you cling harder to the small things you can still make perfect. A perfectly pressed chemise cannot stop a mob, but it is something. It is a thing that can still be controlled when almost nothing else can. The Tuileries years, 1789 through the summer of 1792, pass in a rhythm you come to know as well as you once knew, the rhythm of Versailles, except every part of that rhythm now vibrates with a tension that never fully releases. You wash and press and mend. You watch the crowds in the garden below grow larger and louder through the seasons, watch the newspapers being hawked at the garden gates with headlines that get uglier by the month. You hear from footmen and guards who talk more freely than they should around servants they've stopped quite seeing as people, about factions in the new National Assembly, about the king's stubbornness, about a flight to the eastern border in the summer of 1791 that ends in disaster at a town called Varennes. The royal family recognised and dragged back to Paris like escaped prisoners, which, as far as anyone in the palace is concerned now, is exactly what they are. After Varennes, everything changes again, and this time it changes for you directly, because the guard around the royal apartments doubles, and every servant who comes and goes from the Queen's rooms is watched more closely, questioned more sharply, and you learn to make yourself smaller and quieter than you've ever made yourself before. Because a laundress who draws attention to herself in the summer of 1791 is a laundress who might find herself accused of something she doesn't even understand, by people who are no longer interested in nuance. There is one evening that June that you return to often in memory, precisely because it sits on the very last edge of the ordinary world before everything comes apart. You have climbed, with Bertha and Colette and 2 others, to a small unused attic room high above the garde lounge that has a single dormer window looking out over the Tuileries gardens, and beyond them the rooftops of Paris stretching to a horizon smudged orange with the last of the sunset. You have brought up a stub of candle and a shared heel of bread, and for perhaps an hour the 6 of you sit crowded on the dusty floorboards, simply watching the city below settle into evening. Lamplighters moving along the garden paths, the distant glitter of the river catching the last light. Ordinary Parisians strolling beneath windows that hold a king and queen who are, for this one suspended hour, still simply a family finishing their supper like any other family in the building. Colette, 13 and endlessly curious, asks whether you think the Queen ever climbs to a high window just to look at the view the way you're looking at it now. You don't know the answer. You have never once, in 3 years in this palace, seen anyone with real power stop moving long enough to simply look at anything. You wonder, watching the city breathe below you in the fading light, whether that is its own kind of prison, one that has nothing to do with guards or doors at all, 6 weeks later, that same dormer window will look out on smoke instead of sunset. By the summer of 1792, you are 20 years old, and you have been handling this family's most intimate linens for 7 years, and the palace has become a place you can feel getting ready to break, the way you can feel a storm building in your bones before the sky actually opens. The morning of the 10th of August starts wrong in a way you can feel before you understand why. There's no bread delivery at the usual hour. The kitchen staff are moving faster than usual, and quieter, which is somehow worse than if they'd been shouting. A guardsman you've known by sight for 2 years, a decent man named Fournier who has never once been anything but polite to the linen girls, stops you in a corridor with a chest of freshly pressed sheets in your arms and tells you, in a voice pitched low and urgent, that you should stay in the interior rooms today, not near windows, not near doors that open onto the courtyards. You don't fully understand what he means until you hear the bells, not the ordinary bells that mark the hours across Paris. A different kind of ringing, faster, more of them at once, coming from every direction, the specific sound of a city calling itself to arms, and underneath it, growing louder as the morning goes on, a noise like the one you heard the night the market women marched on Versailles 3 years before, except larger, much larger. A noise made of tens of thousands of voices instead of thousands. Madame Eloff, a different Madame Eloff now, older, greyer, but with the same iron grip on the linen room's discipline, gathers every girl in the pressing room and tells you flatly that nobody is to leave until she says so, and that if anyone hears fighting, everyone gets down on the floor away from the windows and stays there. You spend the next several hours on that floor, between the ironing tables, listening. It starts as shouting, distant, the kind of noise you've grown almost used to over the past 3 years. Then it becomes something else, a sound you have never heard before and will never forget for the rest of your life. The crack and roar of cannon fire. Close, closer than you would have believed possible. The whole building seeming to shudder with each report. Plaster dust drifting down from the ceiling in fine, pale clouds that catch in your hair and your throat. Somewhere beneath the cannon fire, a rattling, continuous crackle that you realize after a horrified moment is musket fire. Not one shot, not 10, but hundreds, sustained, going on and on in a way that gunfire in your imagination never had, because you'd never actually heard real gunfire before. Not like this. Not for this long. Berthe is praying next to you quietly, the same 3 words over and over. One of the youngest girls, a 13-year-old named Colette, who joined the Garde Linge only that spring, is crying without making any sound at all, tears just running down her face while she stares at the ceiling, and you take her hand because it's the only thing you can think to do. And she grips it hard enough to hurt. The floor itself seems to shudder with each cannon report, a vibration you feel through your palms and your knees before you properly hear the sound that caused it, and somewhere far too close a window shatters. Not from a shot, you realize later, but simply from the force of the air itself, glass raining down in a corridor 2 rooms away with a sound like a struck bell. The dust that sifts from the ceiling with every impact gets into your throat, dry and chalky, and you cough into your sleeve because coughing out loud feels, in that moment, like exactly the kind of noise that might draw attention through walls that suddenly feel much thinner than stone should. Someone, you never learn who, is screaming somewhere on a floor below, on and on, a sound that eventually stops in a way you make yourself not think about. The fighting goes on for what feels like a full day, but is probably closer to 2 hours. When it finally starts to die down, the quiet that follows is worse than the noise, a quiet with something wrong underneath it. Madame Eloff sends you, specifically you, because you are steady-handed and because someone has to go, and because she trusts you not to fall apart in a corridor, to find out what has happened to the linen stores in the Queen's apartments, whether they've been touched, whether they need to be moved, whether the rooms themselves are even still standing. It is, as you understand later, a genuinely stupid errand born of a woman who needed to give her frightened staff something to do besides sit and wait. But you go anyway, because you are 20 years old, and you have spent 7 years learning that you do what you're told. The corridors between the linen room and the Queen's apartments, corridors you've walked 1,000 times, are unrecognisable. There is blood on the floor in long, smeared streaks, as though bodies were dragged rather than walked. There is broken glass everywhere, catching what light comes through the shattered windows, crunching under your shoes with every step. There's a boot lying on its side against a wall with no owner anywhere near it, and you make yourself look away from wondering what happened to the foot that was in it. The smell reaches you before you're fully prepared for it. Gunpowder, sharp and acrid, and underneath it something else. Something you've smelled before, only on the butchering days back on your father's farm, and your stomach turns over so hard you have to stop walking and put a hand against the wall until it passes. You learn later, in pieces, what happened while you lay on that floor between the ironing tables. The royal family had fled the palace itself in the early hours, walked across the gardens under guard to take shelter with the Legislative Assembly, leaving behind several hundred Swiss guards, mercenary soldiers, loyal to the crown by contract rather than conviction, but loyal all the same. To hold the palace against a crowd, it had decided that morning that the monarchy's time was finally actually over. The guards held their posts, held them past any reasonable point, past the moment when holding them stopped being defence, and became something closer to slaughter, because the order to cease fire, when it finally came from the king himself, arrived too late for most of them. Nearly 600 Swiss guards died that morning, cut down at their posts or hunted through the palace afterward by a crowd that had tasted blood and wasn't finished. Some of them you hear from a footman who saw it and will not stop talking about it for weeks afterward in a flat, shocked voice, were killed after they'd already surrendered, disarmed, hands raised, killed anyway because the crowd had gone past listening to anything, including reason, including mercy. You reach the Queen's antechamber, and it is a ruin. The mob came through here. You can see exactly where and how. Furniture overturned, mirrors smashed, a portrait of the king slashed diagonally across the face with something sharp, the frame still hanging but the canvas hanging in ribbons, and the linen presses, your linen presses, the ones you have personally stocked and organised and maintained for 3 years, stand open, doors hanging off broken hinges, and the contents are everywhere. Chemises trampled into the broken glass, sheets torn deliberately, not by accident but by hands that wanted to tear them. The fine cambric ripped in long vicious strips. Someone has urinated quite deliberately on a pile of the Queen's finest linen, and the smell of it mixes with the gunpowder and the blood smell in a way that makes you gag again. Underfoot, mixed in with the broken glass, you find small, ordinary objects scattered as though a life had simply been upended and shaken out onto the floor. A single kid glove, a hairpin, a torn page from a devotional book, a child's small wooden top rolled into a corner and somehow, miraculously, unbroken. You find yourself picking your way across the room with the strange, careful attention of someone walking through a graveyard. Not because anyone has told you to be careful, but because something in you refuses to simply trample what's left of these people's ordinary daily objects the way the mob already has. You stand in the doorway for a long moment, unable to make yourself go further in, and that is when you notice the men, 3 of them, ordinary men in the rough coats of the crowd outside, going through the Queen's private writing desk, with the business-like efficiency of people who have done this kind of thing before, or have simply decided, on the spot, that a ransacked palace is a palace with nothing left worth protecting. They are pulling out drawers, dumping the contents onto the floor, sorting through papers and small objects with quick, practiced hands, not looting for jewels particularly, though they'd certainly take those too, but looking, you realise as you watch, for something specific. Letters, evidence, proof, or the appearance of proof of exactly the kind of treasons the pamphlets have been describing for years. One of them looks up and sees you standing in the doorway, and for a moment you are certain you're about to die in this ruined room, 20 years old, with nothing to show for your life but 7 years of perfectly ironed sheets. But he only looks at you, really looks, the way nobody at Versailles or the Tuileries has ever quite looked at you, seeing an actual person rather than a uniform that happens to have a face attached, and says not unkindly, "Girl, you work here?" "The linen room," you manage. "I came to see what needed moving." He gestures at the ruin around him with a short, tired laugh that has no humour in it at all. "Move what you like. Nobody's coming back to sleep in these rooms tonight." You don't know what makes you do what you do next. Perhaps it's simple instinct. 7 years of trained habit toward order asserting itself even in the middle of chaos. A hand reaching automatically to pick something up off the floor the way you'd pick up a dropped pin. Perhaps it's something else. Whatever the reason, as you step further into the room, ostensibly to begin gathering the salvageable linens, your foot catches something small under a fold of torn cambric, and you bend, and you pick it up before you've consciously decided to, and you close your fist around it before the men searching the desk can see what it is. It's a small enamel locket no bigger than your thumbnail on a broken chain. The clasp torn, probably in the general destruction, separated from wherever it was meant to be worn. When you open it later, in private in the dark, you'll find a tiny painted miniature inside, a child's face, unmistakably one of the Queen's own children, the little Dauphin or perhaps his elder sister. You can't quite tell which in the dim candlelight, but a child painted with the kind of careful, loving detail that a mother commissions when she wants to carry a piece of her child with her, always. You don't know why you take it. You have never in 7 years of service taken so much as a stray thread that wasn't yours. But something in you, in that ruined room full of torn sheets and men searching for treason, decides that this one small object, a mother's love for her child, small enough to hide in a closed fist, worth nothing to a revolutionary looking for evidence of crimes against the nation, deserves to survive the day even if nothing else in this room does. You slip it into the pocket sewn inside your own bodice, the one place on your body no search has ever thought to look, because who searches a laundress for treasure? And then you get to work salvaging what you can of the linens, because that is, after everything, still your job, and doing your job is the only thing your hands know how to do when the rest of the world has come apart. The royal family does not return to the Tuileries. You learn, over the following days, that they have been moved, imprisoned, though nobody in the palace uses that word yet not officially, to the Temple, an old fortress tower in a quieter part of Paris that once belonged to the Knights Templar centuries before anyone in this century was born. And here is where the machinery of the royal household, already skeletal, finally seizes up almost entirely. Most of the great retinue that once surrounded the Queen, the ladies of honour, the dressers, the hairdressers who spent hours each morning building architecture out of her hair, are dismissed outright, sent home, or simply left to fend for themselves in a Paris that has stopped needing courtiers. But somebody, some official managing the practical business of imprisoning a former queen, decides that the prisoners will still need clean linen, will still need someone competent to maintain it, and a very small number of household staff are quietly retained for exactly that purpose. You are one of them, whether it's because Madame Eloff recommends you specifically, or because you are simply young and strong enough to carry heavy baskets up narrow tower stairs without complaint, or because nobody with any actual power gives the decision more than 30 seconds of thought. You never learn. But in September of 1792, you find yourself climbing the spiral stone stairs of the Temple Tower for the first time, a basket of linens on your hip, a guard's lantern the only light, and you understand, somewhere around the 40th stair, that your life has changed in a way you don't yet have words for. The Temple is nothing like the Tuileries, and the Tuileries was nothing like Versailles. Versailles was built to overwhelm you with beauty. The Tuileries was old and neglected, but still, underneath everything, a palace. The Temple is a fortress built for war and worship centuries before it was ever meant to hold a king, and it holds cold in its stones the way a well holds water, deep, permanent, unmoved by any season. The rooms allotted to the royal family are on the second and third floors of the great tower, small by any standard a palace would recognise, furnished with whatever pieces could be gathered on short notice, and none of it matching, none of it grand. The windows are narrow, deliberately so, deep set in walls several feet thick, and even in the brightest part of the day the light that reaches the interior is thin and grey, filtered through centuries-old stone that was never designed to let much of the outside world in. You are permitted into the Queen's rooms. You learn quickly that she is now referred to by the guards and officials who control every part of her existence, simply as the widow Capet, her husband's family name used with deliberate contempt, though the king is not yet dead, not yet the title used in advance, as though the guards already know something. The prisoners themselves haven't yet been told. Twice a week, always accompanied, always watched, to exchange soiled linen for clean. The woman you find in those rooms is barely recognisable as the distant bright figure you glimpsed across courtyards at Versailles a decade ago. She has aged more in 3 years than most people age in 15. Her hair, once famously elaborate, is simple now, greying at the temples, though she isn't yet 40. Pulled back plainly because there is no one left to dress it and nowhere she needs to be seen. She dresses in the same few gowns, worn soft with repeated use, and the fine cambric chemises you once handled with such care have been replaced by whatever plain linen the Temple's household can provide. Because the fine things were left behind at the Tuileries, most of them torn or stolen or burned in the ransacking you witnessed that August morning. But she still asks after the quality of the wash, still runs a thumb along a hem to check the stitching. Small things. The habits of a lifetime don't disappear just because the life around them has. The Dauphin, a boy of 7, 8 now, small and pale in the tower's permanent grey light, is the one who breaks your composure the first time you see him properly. He's playing, when you enter with the linen basket that first week, a small quiet game with a set of wooden soldiers on the floor, moving them with the deep private concentration of a child who has learned to make his own entertainment, because there is very little else on offer. He looks up at you with a child's open curiosity, unguarded in a way none of the adults around him can afford to be anymore, and asks you, directly, whether you've come from outside. "From the linen room, Monseigneur," you say, and immediately wonder if you're even allowed to address him that way anymore, whether that title has already been stripped from him, the way it will be stripped from everything else in his family within the year. "Is it still summer outside?" he asks. "I can't tell from the window. It only shows the sky." You tell him gently that autumn has come, that the leaves are turning, that it rained the day before and the street smelled like wet stone. He listens to this small, useless report about the weather with the rapt attention of a boy who's been shown, without anyone quite saying it aloud, that the ordinary world has become something he can only hear about second-hand. You think about your own younger brothers back in Normandy, running through orchards you haven't seen in 7 years, and something in your chest aches in a way that has nothing to do with the Queen at all, and everything to do with this one particular small boy, kept in a tower, asking a laundress whether it's still summer. The Dauphin's elder sister, Madame Royale, a serious, watchful girl of 14, treats you with a different kind of attention entirely. Not curiosity, but a quiet, assessing wariness that you understand completely, because you have felt exactly that wariness yourself toward every stranger who has entered your own narrowing world since the 10th of August. She asks you almost nothing on your visits. She watches you fold linen with the same unblinking attention. She watches the guards, as though she has learned faster than her younger brother that every person who enters this tower now carries the potential to be either an ally or a danger, and that the safest course is simply to give nothing away until you know for certain which. You come, over the following weeks, to recognize the particular rhythm the temple imposes on everyone inside it, prisoners and servants and guards alike, a rhythm built entirely around small scheduled mercies and their equally small scheduled withdrawals. A walk permitted in the Tower Garden, weather allowing, for 1 hour at midday under guard, along a gravel path worn pale by the same feet, pacing the same short distance day after day. Meals delivered at fixed times, adequate but plain, the fine china of Versailles replaced by ordinary crockery that would not have been thought good enough for a minor courtier's kitchen, candles rationed carefully enough that the family spends the long winter evenings largely in near darkness once the short daylight fails. The Queen's needlework. She has taken up plain sewing now, mending her own children's stockings with her own hands, a task that would have been unthinkable to the woman who once commanded an entire garde linge, abandoned by 4 in the afternoon simply because there is no longer enough light left to see the stitches by. There is a single occasion, in that first autumn of imprisonment, when a sympathetic underguard, a young man barely older than you from Burgundy by his accent, who seems to have taken this posting without fully understanding what it would ask of his conscience, allows you, on a delivery day when his superior has gone down to argue with the supply officer about a shortage of candles, to climb a narrow interior stair to the tower's upper platform, ostensibly to check whether rain has gotten into a store of linen kept there for want of better space below. There is no rain damage. There is instead 5 unsupervised minutes at the top of the temple tower, and a view of Paris that takes the breath out of you more completely than the storming of the palace ever did, because it is so entirely indifferently beautiful, spread out beneath a sky doing exactly what skies do regardless of who is imprisoned beneath them. You can see the whole eastern sprawl of the city from up here, chimney smoke rising in hundreds of thin grey threads, the towers of Notre Dame catching the low autumn sun, the ordinary bustling life of a city that has, in the space of a few months, imprisoned its own king and queen, and yet somehow still needs its bread baked and its carts driven, and its washing hung out to dry on lines, strung between buildings far below, oblivious to the tower and everyone it holds. You think, standing there with the wind pulling loose strands of hair across your face, about how strange it is that a view this large can exist directly above a life this small, that the same sky covering half of France covers also this one narrow stone room where a boy asks whether it's still summer. You think, too, though you would never say this aloud to a single living soul, about how easily height turns tragedy into scenery, how the crowd's roar and the cannon fire and the blood on the corridor floor, viewed from up here, would simply look like weather, like something happening to a toy city rather than a real one. You understand in that moment something about why the nobility built palaces so tall and gardens so vast in the first place. Distance is its own kind of mercy and its own kind of cruelty, depending entirely on which side of it you're standing. The young guard calls up that his superior is returning, and you go back down the narrow stair with your empty excuse about rain damage still technically true, and you do not climb that tower again for the remainder of the family's imprisonment there. The winter of 1792 into 1793 is the coldest you can remember, and the temple holds that cold the way it holds everything permanently in its bones. The water in the small basin left for washing in the family's rooms freezes solid most nights that January. A skin of ice thick enough that you have to break it with the flat of a spoon before anyone can use it in the morning. And your own hands carrying baskets up that spiral stair in weather this cold ache in a way that goes past the ordinary chapping you've known for years and settles instead into a deep, bone-level throb that doesn't fully leave you again until spring. You bring extra blankets up with the linen deliveries when the guards allow it, which isn't always. The windows, you learn, are deliberately kept slightly open even in the depths of winter on the orders of certain officials who believe, or claim to believe, that fresh air prevents the prisoners from plotting, as though conspiracy requires stale air specifically. The actual effect is that the royal family spends the coldest months of their imprisonment shivering in rooms that never properly warm, and you spend those same months hauling linen up icy stone stairs, with your own hands cracked and bleeding from cold and lie both, same as they always have been, same as they were at Versailles, except now there is no comfortable guard liege to retreat to afterward, only a cramped servants' room shared with 3 other women retained for similarly practical, similarly grim purposes. In January of 1793 the king is taken from the tower and does not come back. You are not there the morning it happens. You learn about it the way you learn everything now, second-hand, from guards talking too loudly in corridors, from a newspaper someone leaves folded on a bench that you read by candlelight later, with your heart hammering. But you are there, 2 days afterward, when you bring linen up to the Queen's rooms and find her unable, for the first time in all the months you've known her, in this reduced and imprisoned form, to speak to you at all. She sits by the narrow window with her hands folded in her lap, not moving, not looking at anything in particular, and you set down the clean linen and gather the soiled linen without a word passing between you, because there is nothing you could possibly say that wouldn't be an insult to the size of what has happened. The Dauphin, who is, in the eyes of every remaining royalist in France and in most of the crowned courts of Europe, now technically a king himself, a fact that will change absolutely nothing about his circumstances and will in fact make them considerably worse. asks you the next time you see him whether his father is coming back soon. You do not know how to answer this. Nobody has apparently found the words to tell him directly what has happened. Or perhaps they have, and he has simply refused to absorb it the way children sometimes refuse the unabsorbable. And you find yourself, a laundress with no authority to comfort or correct a former king, simply saying that some absences last a long time, and that the people who love us stay with us anyway, in the ways that matter. It is not an answer. It is the closest thing to comfort you have to offer, and it will have to do, because nobody has given you anything better to work with. The Queen's mourning in the weeks after expresses itself in a way that only someone who has spent 8 years handling her linens would ever notice at all. She asks quietly whether it might be possible to have a length of black ribbon, nothing grand, simply enough to sew a mourning band onto her son's sleeve, because the boy is too young to be given black clothing outright without frightening him further, but old enough, she believes, to eventually understand what a small, dark ribbon on his cuff is meant to mean. It takes you nearly 2 weeks to source even that much black ribbon in a Paris where such things have become, for reasons that have everything to do with politics and nothing to do with cloth, difficult and faintly dangerous to purchase in quantity. You find a length of it eventually from an old haberdasher near the temple, who asks no questions and charges you nothing at all when you explain, in the barest possible terms, who it is for. You deliver it folded inside a clean chemise, hidden the way you will learn over the following year to hide a great many small things inside a great many folds of clean linen, because a basket of washing is the one object in the entire building that nobody with any real power has ever thought worth searching closely. The months that follow blur in a way that the earlier years never did. The sameness of grey stone and narrow windows and rationed candles wearing down the sharp edges of individual days until they run together into a single long grey season. You watch the Queen grow thinner. You watch her hair, when you occasionally catch a glimpse of it unbound, turn fully white at the roots, though she has not yet reached her 40th year. A thing you have heard happens to people under sufficient strain, though you had always assumed it was simply a story people told, until you saw it happen with your own eyes over the course of a single winter. In the summer of 1793 you learn that she is to be separated from her children and moved. The morning it happens, you're not permitted into the tower at all. Extra guards, unfamiliar faces, an atmosphere of controlled tension that reminds you unpleasantly of the morning before the 10th of August the year before. You wait outside in the temple's outer courtyard with a basket of linen you're not allowed to deliver, and you hear, through a window you should not be standing near, the sound of a mother being told she's to be taken from her remaining child, a sound that does not translate into words, that is simply grief given voice in its rawest possible form, and you stand there in the courtyard with your basket of clean sheets, and you cry without meaning to, quietly where none of the guards can see, because there is nothing else available to you to do with what you are hearing. She is taken that day to the conciergerie, a prison on the Ile de la Cité, attached directly to the halls of the Revolutionary Tribunal, that will, everyone already understands without anyone saying it aloud, eventually try her for her life. You do not expect to see her again. Why would you? A laundress from the temple has no reason to follow a prisoner to the conciergerie, no official standing, no claim on the new administration's attention at all. But 3 weeks after her transfer, a message reaches the small remaining temple household staff. The conciergerie's own linen arrangements are inadequate. The prisoner's health is apparently a matter of some concern to certain officials who would rather not be blamed if a former queen dies of neglect before the tribunal gets its chance to try her properly, and staff experienced with her specific requirements are wanted, on a temporary basis, twice weekly. You volunteer before you've entirely thought it through. Berta, when you tell her, asks you outright whether you've lost your mind, whether you understand what associating yourself, even in this small practical way, with the prisoner might mean for you if the political winds shift even slightly further. You don't have a good answer for her. You only know that you have spent 7 years of your life with your hands on this woman's most private linens, that you held a dauphin's hand-drawn locket against your own heart through a massacre, that something in you cannot simply let her disappear into a stone building and vanish from your knowledge entirely, without at least trying to see that her sheets, at the very least, are clean. The conciergerie makes the temple look almost comfortable by comparison. It is a genuine medieval prison, ancient even by the standards of a city as old as Paris, built directly against the river so that its lowest levels flood with every rise of the Seine, damp seeping permanently into walls that have held prisoners for 400 years before you were ever born. The cell allotted to the former queen, you cannot make yourself call her the widow Capet, not in your own thoughts, whatever the official paperwork insists, is small, perhaps 12 feet by 10, with a single barred window set high in the wall, too high to see anything through except a narrow strip of grey Paris sky, and, if you stand at exactly the right angle, a sliver of the river itself. The walls sweat moisture, in a way that no amount of airing or fires can fully counteract. The straw mattress she sleeps on has to be changed constantly, because it grows damp and mouldy within days. You bring dry linens, and within a week of the conciergerie's permanent dampness, they have already begun to smell faintly of mildew no matter how carefully you've aired and pressed them, and there's nothing you can do about this. No craft or diligence sufficient to fight a building that is quite literally sinking into a river. You press your palm flat against the stone wall once, early on, simply to test what everyone has told you about it, and find it cold and faintly wet even in a week when it has not rained at all. A permanent sweat seeping up out of foundations laid centuries before anyone thought to ask whether a building this close to a river ought to be used for housing the living rather than simply the condemned passing briefly through it. The sound of the conciergerie is different from every other sound you've learned to live inside over these years. Not the cannon fire of the Tuileries, not the near silence of the temple's thick fortress walls, but a constant low murmur of water somewhere beneath the floors, the Seine pressing endlessly against foundations that were never meant to hold it back so directly. And beneath that murmur, at almost any hour, the sound of other prisoners elsewhere in the building. A cough, a low argument once, unmistakably, someone singing very quietly to themselves in a language you don't recognize, cut off abruptly by a guard's sharp order to be silent. You come to understand, spending even these brief twice-weekly hours inside it, that a prison like this one holds its sounds the way it holds its damp permanently, in a way that never quite lets a single one of them fully fade. A young woman named Rosalie Lamorlière works as a servant assigned more permanently to the cell than you are, tending to the prisoner's daily needs in ways your twice-weekly linen deliveries don't cover, and over the weeks you come to know her a little, exchanging quiet observations in the narrow corridor outside the cell while the guards aren't paying close attention. Rosalie tells you things you wouldn't otherwise know, that the prisoner eats almost nothing most days, that she has taken to hiding small scraps of what little food she's given, not out of hunger exactly, but out of some private, unexplainable need to have something, anything, that is entirely her own and unmonitored. That she spends long hours simply sitting with her hands in her lap, the way you first saw her after the king's execution, staring at nothing. There is a guard permanently stationed inside the cell itself, day and night, a detail you find almost unbearable to think about. That this woman cannot use a chamber pot, cannot weep, cannot sleep without a stranger's eyes on her at all times, a final and total stripping away of every last shred of privacy a human being might reasonably expect, even in captivity, even facing death. You learn from Rosalie that a folding screen was eventually permitted, a small mercy negotiated by someone with slightly more compassion than the system generally allows, so that at least the most basic bodily functions can happen out of direct sight, though never out of earshot, never truly private at all. You bring the linens twice a week through the late summer and into the autumn of 1793, and each visit the woman in that cell seems smaller than the last, as though the dampness of the walls is somehow drawing the substance out of her, along with the moisture it draws from everything else. She's still on the visits when she has the strength to speak at all, asks after small things, whether the hems are holding, whether you've had trouble getting the linen dry in weather this wet. You wonder sometimes whether these small domestic questions are the last remaining thread connecting her to a version of herself that existed before any of this. A woman who once cared, genuinely and simply, about the quality of her chemises, back before chemises became the least of anyone's concerns. There is a particular kind of waiting that settles over the conciergerie through September and into October of 1793, a waiting you feel in your own body every time you cross the bridge to make a delivery, a tightening in your chest that begins the moment you see the prison's grey turrets rising above the quay and doesn't release again until you're safely back across the river. You learn to read the mood of the building the way you once learned to read the mood of the Queen's linens. The guards more numerous some weeks than others, the corridors sometimes strangely empty, sometimes crowded with officials moving with the particular brisk, self-important energy of men who believe history is about to notice them. Rosalie tells you, in late September, that the prisoner has begun asking, in the careful, indirect way that 8 months of imprisonment have taught her to ask anything at all, whether news has come of her sister-in-law and remaining daughter, whether any word has reached the conciergerie of the wider world beyond its walls, whether, and this question, Rosalie says, was asked so quietly she almost missed it, there's been any word from Vienna, from her own family, from the brother who sits on the Austrian throne and has done, in 8 months of his sister's imprisonment, essentially nothing beyond issuing statements that change nothing at all. There is no good answer to give her. Rosalie gives none, and neither on your own visits do you. In October, the tribunal finally moves against her. The trial itself lasts barely 2 days, a fact that stuns even people far more politically sophisticated than a laundress, because everyone in Paris who has followed the proceedings against other prisoners over the preceding year understands that 2 days is nothing, that this is a trial designed to reach its conclusion rather than to examine anything, that the verdict was essentially decided before the first witness was called. You're not permitted anywhere near the tribunal itself, obviously. That world of judges and prosecutors and public galleries is as far above your station as the Queen's own former court ever was. Further in some ways, because at least the linen room had a defined place within the palace's structure, whereas the revolutionary tribunal has no place at all for a laundress, except as someone who might, theoretically, be called to testify about the household's habits, which mercifully never happens. What you know of the trial, you know from Rosalie, and from the newspapers that circulate through Paris faster and more viciously than any pamphlet ever did at Versailles, filled with accusations both political and deeply, viciously personal, treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and worse, accusations aimed specifically at destroying whatever human sympathy the public might still hold for a mother and a woman. Accusations so cruel and so clearly fabricated that even some of the more reasonable voices covering the proceedings express private discomfort at how far the prosecution has been willing to reach. You stand outside the Palais de Justice yourself for a portion of the second day, unable to stay away entirely despite having no legitimate reason to be there, pressed into a crowd of onlookers held back from the actual courtroom by a line of guards, and you catch fragments of testimony carried out through opened doors and repeated hand-to-hand through the waiting crowd. A former servant testifying to household expenses inflated into treason, a former minister's clerk producing intercepted letters whose actual contents nobody in the crowd around you seems able to agree on. The prisoner herself, you're told by a woman who managed to get closer to the doors than you did, answers each accusation with a composure that seems to unsettle the prosecution more than any outburst would have. A stillness that 17 years of being watched, judged, and performed at from every direction has apparently trained into her more thoroughly than any of her accusers understand. There is one exchange, repeated to you second-hand and then third-hand until you can no longer be entirely certain of its exact words, that stays with you regardless. A prosecutor pressing her in front of the packed public gallery with an accusation so deliberately intimate and cruel regarding her relationship with her own son that even some in that hostile crowd are said to have gone quiet, uncomfortable, and that the prisoner, rather than answering the accusation directly, simply appealed to every mother present in the room to judge for themselves whether such a thing could be true. You do not know, hearing this fragment second-hand on a cold October street corner, whether it happened exactly this way, or whether it has already begun the process every dramatic moment undergoes once it leaves the room where it actually happened, and starts being carried mouth to mouth through a hungry city. You only know that when you hear it, standing in that crowd with your basket of undelivered mending on your hip, you have to turn your face away so the strangers around you won't see you cry for a woman half of them still call the enemy of France. The verdict, when it comes on the 16th of October, is exactly what everyone already understood it would be. Death, by the same instrument that has claimed hundreds of others over the preceding months. The same machine that took the king himself 9 months before at what was once the place Louis XV, and is now called, with the particular grim humour for revolution renaming everything it touches, the Place de la Révolution. She is to be executed that same day. There is no delay, no waiting period, nothing resembling the slow institutional pace you might expect a monarchy's fall to observe. The tribunal condemns her in the small hours of the morning, and by the time the ordinary bells of Paris are ringing for midday, she is already being prepared. You learn from Rosalie in a hurried, tear-choked exchange in the conciergerie's corridor that morning. You have come unbidden, unrostered, simply because you could not stay away, could not let this happen without at least standing somewhere near where it happened, that she'd be given no black mourning clothes, denied even that small dignity, and dressed instead in a plain white gown, her hair cut short and covered with a simple cap, because a woman about to be executed cannot be permitted the dangerous dignity of elaborate hair that might somehow interfere with the blade's work. Rosalie tells you, her own hand shaking so badly around the words that you have to lean close to catch all of them, that the prisoner's hands were bound behind her back rather than in front, an indignity apparently standard for the tumbrel, but one that Rosalie had somehow never fully pictured until she watched it done, and that the executioner's assistant, a young man doing a task that has clearly not gotten any easier for him, despite months of practice, would not quite meet her eyes while he worked the cord tight enough to hold, but not, he mutters, more than that's needed. Small mercies, offered by strangers whose job is otherwise entirely without mercy. You find, hearing this, that you cannot decide whether it comforts you or makes the whole morning worse, and you conclude, eventually, that it is probably both at once, the way almost everything about that day turns out to be both at once. The tumbrel itself, an open cart normally used to haul rubble or dung through the streets, requisitioned now for a use its builder never imagined, creaks out through the conciergerie's gate a little after 11 in the morning, and the crowd that has gathered along the route, down the quay, across the Pont au Change, through streets you have walked 100 times on ordinary errands, and will never again be able to walk without seeing this particular procession laid like a transparency over the ordinary traffic, presses close enough to the cart's sides that guards on horseback have to force a corridor through the mass of bodies simply to keep the vehicle moving at all. The streets of the Ile de la Cité and the quay leading toward the square are, on the morning of the 16th of October, entirely unlike the streets you have walked on any ordinary errand day. Vendors have set up along the route as though for a festival, selling little printed sheets giving an account, invented in advance, the way the ballads about highway robbers back in the Tuileries years were always invented in advance, of the condemned woman's supposed final words, though nobody selling these sheets has any more idea than you do what will actually be said, if anything is said at all. A man near the Pont Neuf is selling roasted chestnuts from a brazier. The smell of scorched shell and sweet flesh mixing incongruously with the general odour of a crowd, this size pressed together on a cool October morning. Wet wool, unwashed bodies, the sour tang of cheap wine already being passed from hand to hand, though it is barely past 10 in the morning. Windows along the route have been rented out for the occasion, the same way you remember windows and balconies being rented for the great execution processions your father used to describe from his own youth in Rouen. Ordinary householders discovering that a good view of a queen's final journey is worth more for one single morning than a month of their usual rent. Children are lifted onto shoulders. An old woman near you crosses herself repeatedly, muttering, while the young man beside her jeers loudly enough that people turn to look, and neither of them seems to notice or care about the other's completely opposite reaction to the same unfolding morning. You do not go to the Place de la Révolution itself. You cannot make yourself. You have watched enough of this woman's life pass through your hands in linen and lace and mildewed straw over 8 years, and you find, standing in the conciergerie's outer courtyard as the tumbrel is loaded in the square outside, that you simply cannot make your feet carry you the distance required to watch the final part happen with your own eyes. You stand instead at the edge of the crowd gathered near the Pont Neuf, close enough to hear the roar of the much larger crowd further off at the actual place of execution when it finally rises, a sound you recognize immediately and will never be able to unhear for the rest of your life. because it is the exact same sound you heard from the floor of the linen room at the Tuileries 14 months before, the sound of a crowd getting the thing it has decided it wants. You do not need to see the blade fall to know the precise moment it happens. The sound tells you everything. A city exhaling something it has held in its chest for 4 years. An old man standing near you at the edge of the crowd. A cobbler by the leather apron he still wears despite having apparently abandoned his bench mid-morning to come and stand here. Watches your face as the roar rises and falls away again and says, to nobody in particular, in the flat voice of someone who has simply seen too much of this same century to have any strong reaction left in him. I watched them execute a man for stealing a loaf of bread when I was your age. Now they execute queens. The machine doesn't care who it's fed. It only cares that it keeps being fed. He looks at you a moment longer, taking in whatever your face is showing him that you'd rather it wasn't. Don't let this be the thing you remember Paris by, girl. Paris will give you other mornings if you let it. This one wasn't the only one there'll ever be. You do not know his name. You never see him again. But you think of that sentence more than once in the years that follow, on mornings when Paris does in fact give you other things to remember it by. A wedding, a christening, a shop of your own, with your own name painted above the door. And you find, slowly, that he was right. Though it takes you longer than a single morning to believe it. You stand very still for a long moment afterward, in a crowd of strangers who are already beginning to disperse, already talking about what they'll have for their midday meal, already moving on, because for most of them this was simply an event, a piece of news to carry home, not 8 years of hands in lye water and a small painted locket carried against the heart through a massacre. And then, because you are who you are, because your hands have never in your life known how to be idle in the face of grief, you do the only thing that makes any sense to you. You go back to the conciergerie. There is, in the hours immediately following an execution of this scale, a strange lull in the machinery of the prison. The guards who would normally be alert to every movement are instead gathered in tight knots, talking among themselves in low, urgent voices about what they've just witnessed, about what it means, about whether they'll be paid extra for the day's duty. A prison that has just watched its most famous prisoner taken away to die is, for a brief window of an hour or two, administratively distracted in a way it is almost never otherwise. You use that window. You tell the guard at the corridor entrance, with a steadiness in your voice that surprises even you, that you've come to collect the household linens before someone unauthorized gets into the cell and starts taking things that don't belong to them. A lie built entirely on the guard's own laziness, because he has absolutely no interest in supervising a linen inventory personally, when there are far more interesting things happening elsewhere in the building that day, and he waves you through with barely a glance. The cell, when you step inside, is exactly as she left it that morning, and somehow that is worse than any amount of destruction could have been. The damp straw mattress, indented still with the shape of a body that occupied it for weeks. The narrow window with its thin strip of grey sky, unchanged, indifferent. A small wooden table where a single half-finished cup of some thin broth sits going cold, because she apparently could not finish even that on the morning of her own death. And on the floor beside the bed, half hidden beneath the edge of the straw mattress where a guard doing a cursory search might easily miss it, a small folded piece of paper. Your hands are shaking as you pick it up, though you tell yourself, in the moment, that it's only because you're moving quickly, because you don't know how long the guard's distraction will last. It is not, as you half expect and half dread, some final desperate political document, some confession or accusation that might drag you into danger simply for having touched it. It is smaller and quieter than that, and somehow that makes it land harder. A few lines, unfinished, the handwriting shaky in a way that speaks of a hand that could barely hold the pen steady, addressed to no one by name, the words trailing off mid-sentence as though the writer either ran out of time or simply ran out of whatever strength it takes to finish putting grief into words. You do not fully understand, reading it there in the damp cell in the fading light of an October afternoon, everything it is trying to say. You understand only that it is a mother's unfinished attempt to say goodbye to children she will never see again, and that it was never meant for the eyes of a tribunal, or a newspaper, or history at all. It was meant for exactly the small, private, undignified moment in which it was written, and then abandoned, half finished, because there simply wasn't enough time left in the world to finish it properly. You do not know, in the moment, what you're supposed to do with this. Handing it to the guards feels like a betrayal you cannot name precisely, but feel with total certainty in your chest. You have watched this family stripped of every possible dignity for 8 years, watched their linens torn and urinated on, watched a mother separated from a child by the simple administrative violence of a door closing, and you find that you cannot, physically cannot, make your hand deliver this last small private thing into the same machinery that has already taken everything else. You fold it small, smaller than it already was, and you place it, along with the locket you've carried in your bodice for 14 months without ever once being searched, into the deepest pocket sewn into the lining of your own petticoat, a pocket meant originally for carrying pins and thread, and the small, practical tools of a laundress's trade, now carrying instead the last physical trace of a woman's unfinished love for her children. You finish gathering the actual linens, because your original excuse to the guard needs to remain true, needs to hold up if anyone checks. Folding the damp sheets and the worn chemise she wore in her final days into your basket, with hands that have done this exact motion 10,000 times before, and have never once done it feeling like this. As you're leaving, a second search party arrives. 3 officials this time, more careful, more official than the guards who let you pass, clearly under orders to search the cell properly for exactly the kind of items you've just tucked away, and you feel your heart go absolutely still in your chest as one of them stops you directly in the corridor, blocking your path with the basket of linen between you. "What's in the basket?" he says. Not a question, really. A demand. You show him. Sheets, a chemise, a worn cap, the ordinary detritus of a body that lived in a small stone room for months and needed, even at the end, the basic dignity of clean cloth. Your fingers, folding that last worn cap into the basket, find one more thing you almost miss entirely. A single strand of hair, coarser and greyer than you remember it being even a year before, caught in the weave of the linen where a head had rested against it through countless sleepless nights. You do not know why this, of all the small physical traces left behind in that cell, is the one that finally breaks something loose in your chest that the locket and the letter had not managed to break. Perhaps because a lock of hair deliberately kept is a keepsake, a decision, something meant to be found and treasured. A single strand caught by accident in a pillowcase is not a keepsake at all. It is simply what a body leaves behind without meaning to. The way any body does. The way your own hair catches in your own pillow every night without your ever once thinking about it. It is proof, more than anything else in that room, that whatever else she had become to the tribunal and the newspapers and the crowd on the Place de la Révolution, she had also, every single night for weeks, simply been a person trying to sleep on damp straw in a cell that never properly warmed. You wind the strand carefully around your finger, then tuck it too into the same deep pocket that already holds the locket, because you find in that moment that you're no longer capable of leaving behind a single trace of this woman for anyone else to sweep away with the rest of the day's ordinary rubbish. He goes through it with rough, impatient hands, unfolding what you had carefully folded, checking for anything hidden in the seams, and for one long, suspended moment you're entirely certain he is going to reach for you next, going to search your person the way he's searching the basket, and you think, with a clarity that surprises you even in your own fear, about exactly how you would explain a dauphin's locket and a queen's unfinished letter hidden in a laundress's petticoat to a revolutionary official 3 hours after an execution. He doesn't search you. He finds nothing objectionable in a basket of laundry, because laundry is exactly what a laundress is supposed to carry, and after a long, unhurried moment of glaring at you as though daring you to give him a reason, he shoves the basket back into your arms and tells you to get out and not come back without proper authorization next time. You walk out of the conciergerie with your legs shaking so badly you have to stop twice on the bridge back across the river, gripping the stone parapet, breathing until the world stops tilting. You do not tell anyone what you carry. Not Berthe, not Rosalie, not the small remaining circle of former household staff scattered now across a Paris that has stopped needing most of them entirely. For the remaining months of the terror, and it goes on for nearly another year after that October afternoon, the machinery of the tribunal claiming thousands more before it finally, exhaustedly, turns on itself and consumes even the men who built it. You keep the locket and the folded, unfinished letter hidden in the same pocket, moving them from garment to garment as you're forced to change your circumstances, taking in mending work where you can find it, living in increasingly cramped rooms as your savings run out, always with that small folded weight against your body, a physical reminder of the exact moment your own quiet life intersected with history in a way nobody will ever write down, because who interviews a laundress? There is one evening in the depths of that terrible winter of 1793 into 1794, when a neighbour in your rooming house, a woman with sharp eyes and looser morals about other people's business than you'd like, corners you on the shared stairwell and asks not entirely idly why a girl of your station carries herself so carefully, so tensely, as though guarding something. You tell her, with a steadiness that cost you more than she'll ever know, that you're simply tired, that everyone in Paris is tired this winter, which is true enough to satisfy her, and true enough, in its own way, to satisfy you too. You climb one evening in the spring of 1794 to the top of the bell tower of a small church near your rooming house, a place you've gone occasionally over the preceding months, when the walls of your own small room become too much to bear, because the church's ancient verger, an old man who has long since stopped questioning the private griefs of the young women who occasionally climb his stairs to sit quietly among the bells, has never once turned you away. From the top of that tower on a clear evening, you can see an astonishing sweep of Paris, the twin towers of Notre Dame rising pale in the distance, the silver ribbon of the Seine cutting through everything, the rooftops of the Ile de la Cité, where the conciergerie still holds whatever new prisoners the tribunal has decided need holding this week. Somewhere down there, invisible from this height but present all the same, is the Place de la Révolution, and the machine that stands permanently in it now, and you find, standing at this height with the wind pulling your shawl, that you can hold the entire scope of what has happened in your mind at once in a way you never could while living inside it day by day. A palace built to overwhelm with beauty, a tower built to hold cold, a prison built to hold damp, a square built originally for nothing more sinister than a royal statue now given over entirely to a machine that has, by this point, taken more lives than you can bear to count. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, your own hands, doing the same small, quiet work they've always done, washing, folding, pressing, carrying, while an entire world reorganized itself violently around the simple, unglamorous fact of cloth that needed to be clean. You think, standing there about the Dauphin and what has happened to him, past now, you've heard, into the custody of a shoemaker named Simon, kept in conditions in the temple that you understand, from the little that filters out, are considerably worse than anything his mother endured. And you find that you cannot bear to think about this for very long before your chest closes up entirely. So you make yourself stop because there is nothing you can do for him from a bell tower. Nothing you've ever been able to do for any of them except keep their cloth clean and, in the end, keep two small objects safe that nobody else thought worth protecting. You do not see Rosalie again after that autumn. The conciergerie staff are reshuffled repeatedly over the following months as the tribunal moves on to consuming other prisoners, and by the time the worst of the terror has passed, you've lost track of her entirely. Though you hear, years later, from a mutual acquaintance, that she married a printer and lived out a long, quiet, entirely unremarkable life in a quarter of Paris that never once learned what she had witnessed in that damp cell, because she chose, like you, to carry it privately rather than trade on it for notice. Bertha fares less well. She is denounced in the winter of 1793 by a jealous neighbour over some triviality that has nothing to do with the royal household at all. An unpaid debt, a soured friendship, the kind of petty grievance that the machinery of the terror, starved for victims to justify its own continued existence, has by then learned to swallow whole regardless of its actual size. She spends 4 months in a different prison entirely, is never brought to trial, and is released only when the whole apparatus finally collapses under its own weight in the summer of 1794, thinner and greyer and permanently quieter than the woman who once had an opinion about everything. She comes to find you within a week of her release, and the two of you sit together in your small rented room and say almost nothing useful to each other for a long time, because there is nothing useful to say, and simply sitting together, alive, in the same room, turns out to be enough. Colette, the youngest of you all, the girl who cried without sound on the floor of the linen room while cannon fire shook the ceiling, does not survive the winter of 1794, not through violence, not through the tribunal, but through the ordinary, unclamorous cruelty of a fever that runs through the crowded lodging house where she'd found work after the household disbanded. The same kind of fever that has taken servant girls in every century, regardless of which government happens to be in power that particular year. You attend what burial the family can afford, a plain grave with no marker beyond a wooden cross that will rot within a decade, and you think, standing over it, that history will remember an execution witnessed by thousands, and will never once record the name of a 13-year-old laundry girl who simply ran out of luck in a hard winter, and that this, more than almost anything else you witnessed in those years, is the actual shape of how the world sorts out whose grief gets remembered and whose does not. The terror itself finally burns through Paris and consumes its own architect within the year. The man most associated with the machinery of it all is taken to the same square, the same blade, in the summer of 1794, and the city, exhausted past the point of celebration, simply exhales and begins, slowly, cautiously, to try to remember how to be an ordinary place again. The shop itself, when you finally open it in 1801 with savings scraped together over years of piecework and a small loan from Berthe, who by then has married a tradesman and has a little capital of her own to spare, sits on a narrow street not far from where the old Gare Linge once stood, though the palace above it now stands mostly empty, its staterooms shuttered, its gardens grown a little wild for want of the army of gardeners who once kept every hedge in geometric submission. You hang a plain sign, nothing grand, just your name and the word couturière. And you take on your first apprentice within the year, a girl of 13 from Picardy, whose hands, you notice on her very first morning, are shaking with exactly the same fear yours once carried, and you find yourself repeating, almost word for word, the thing Madame Eloff once said to you about hands that tell the truth, and you understand, saying it, that some inheritances pass down through words as surely as through locked drawers. Business is slow at first, then steadier, as Paris itself grows steadier under Bonaparte's increasingly firm hand. And by the time you're 30, you have 2 apprentices, a small but reliable clientele of merchants' wives and minor officials' daughters, and a life that would have been entirely unimaginable to the frightened girl who first put her hands into a boiling copper of lye at Versailles 15 years before. You do not advertise, ever in all those years, the particular history of your earlier service. A seamstress who once handled a queen's linens is either an asset or a liability, depending entirely on which government happens to be watching that decade, and you have learned by then the exact value of staying furniture. You do not immediately know what to do with the locket and the letter once the immediate danger of possessing them begins, gradually to fade. For years, actual years, through the uncertain governments that follow, through a general named Bonaparte who rises out of the chaos and eventually crowns himself something considerably grander than a general, through wars and further upheavals that you follow now mostly through newspapers rather than through your own hands, because you have, by your late 20s, finally left domestic service behind entirely and set up as an independent seamstress with 2 apprentices of your own in a small shop that would have been unimaginable to the frightened 15-year-old who first put her hands in a boiling copper of lye. You simply keep them. Wrapped now in a small cloth pouch rather than a petticoat pocket, kept in a locked drawer in your own modest household, taken out perhaps once a year on the anniversary to be looked at and then put away again. It is not until 1815, more than 2 decades after that October afternoon, when the monarchy is restored, briefly, uncertainly, but restored nonetheless. A surviving royal brother returned to a throne that everyone, including him, seems faintly astonished still exists. That you finally decide what must be done. You're in your early 40s now, your own hands finally beginning to show the particular stiffness of age, on top of decades of lye and needlework, and you write, with considerable difficulty because you were never taught to write with any real fluency, a short and careful letter to the office of the restored royal household, explaining as simply and honestly as you can who you were and what you had carried and why. You do not know, sending that letter, whether anyone will believe you, whether a laundress's account of a locket and an unfinished letter salvaged from a ransacked palace and a death cell will be given any credence at all against the far grander and more self-serving claims of the many people who will, in these restoration years, suddenly discover themselves to have been devoted royalists all along. But someone does believe you, or at least someone in that office decides the objects themselves speak clearly enough of their own history that your account hardly needs to be doubted. And in the winter of 1816 you are asked, with a formality that leaves you almost as unsteady as the day the tribunal official searched your basket of linen, to present yourself at a government office to hand over what you have kept. The office itself, when you arrive on a grey January morning in 1816 with a small cloth pouch clutched inside your coat pocket, exactly the way you once clutched the same objects inside a petticoat lining, is nothing grand. A plain room with a plain desk and a clerk who has clearly processed a great many similarly delicate restitutions in the month since the monarchy's return, because he receives your account with a weary, practised gentleness that suggests he has heard stranger and sadder versions of the same basic story many times already that winter. He asks you to describe in your own words exactly how you came to possess each item, and you tell him the ransacked antechamber, the men searching the writing desk, the damp straw mattress and the folded paper half hidden beneath its edge. And he writes it all down without once looking up to challenge any part of it, because he has apparently learned in this new business of sorting truth from opportunism in a restored kingdom hungry for relics of its own martyred past, that the plainest accounts are almost always the truest ones. The elaborate stories he tells you once, setting down his pen for a moment, almost always come from people who are nowhere near the events they describe. Nobody invents a story about a mildewed straw mattress and a half-finished cup of cold broth. Only someone who actually stood in that room would think to mention the broth at all. He asks you at the end whether you wish your name recorded alongside the account, to be entered formally into whatever record the restored household intends to keep of such restitutions. You decline, and he does not press you, and you walk out of that plain grey office and back across a Paris that has, by 1816, largely returned to the business of ordinary life, into a winter afternoon that smells of wood smoke and wet cobblestone, and absolutely nothing at all like the lye and gunpowder and damp stone that once defined the whole of what your hands knew. You do not ask for money, though it is quietly offered, and you find yourself, in a moment of genuine surprise at your own dignity, declining it. You ask only, if it can be arranged, to be told what eventually becomes of the two small objects, whether the locket finds its way, in whatever roundabout fashion history allows, back toward the surviving members of a family that has already lost so much, and whether the unfinished letter is treated with whatever gentleness such a fragile private thing deserves, rather than being paraded as a political relic in a newspaper. You are told some months later, in a brief and formal note that nonetheless makes your hands shake as you read it, that the locket has been passed through careful and discreet channels to the one surviving child, a daughter now grown into a woman in her late 30s, who's lived a life stranger and sadder than almost anyone else's in Europe, returned finally from years of Austrian exile to a France that both remembers and has tried very hard to forget her family. You are told nothing at all about the letter's ultimate fate, and you decide on reflection that this silence is probably the correct and gentlest outcome, that some things, once returned to the hands that have the right to hold them, are nobody else's business at all, least of all a laundress's, however long she carried them. You live another 30 years after that, long enough to see the monarchy topple again, and rise again, and topple once more, long enough to grow genuinely old in a Paris that keeps reinventing itself around you at a speed that never quite stops astonishing you, and you tell this story: the linen room, the massacre, the tower, the cell, the folded letter under the straw mattress, to exactly one person in all those decades, a granddaughter who sits at your knee on winter evenings by then, demanding stories the way children always do, and who listens to this particular one with the wide, serious eyes of a child who understands somehow, without being told directly, that what she's hearing is not simply a story, but something closer to an inheritance. You tell her about the smell of lye and starch, the weight of wet cambric, the particular ache that settles into forearms after a full day at the washing tubs. You tell her about a small boy asking a laundress whether it was still summer outside a tower window. You tell her about the sound a crowd makes when it finally gets the thing it has decided it wants, a sound you have never once in 50 years managed to entirely stop hearing in the quiet moments before sleep. You tell her, last of all, very quietly, about a folded piece of paper found under a damp straw mattress on an October afternoon, and about carrying it against your own heart for over 20 years before finally letting it go. She asks you many other things too, this granddaughter, over the years of winter evenings that this particular story stretches across, because you never tell it all in a single sitting. You learned long ago that some stories are too heavy to hand a child all at once, the way you'd never hand a child a full basket of wet linen before her arms had grown strong enough to carry it. She asks whether the little Dauphin ever got to go outside properly again, and you tell her gently that he did not, that he lived out the remainder of his short life in conditions you still cannot fully bring yourself to describe even to a grown woman, let alone a child, and that he died in that same temple tower not quite 10 years old, alone in every way that matters, in the summer of 1795, and that this, more than the guillotine, more than the crowd's roar, is the single fact from those years that has never once stopped aching in you, decades on. She asks whether the sister survived, and you tell her, with more comfort to offer this time, that she did, that she was eventually exchanged for French prisoners of war and lived on into an old age of her own, marrying a cousin, watching empires rise and fall around her, the way you watched them rise and fall around yourself. Two women who happened to share the same terrible autumn of 1793 from entirely different sides of a locked door. She asks you whether you ever hated the Queen for the 7 years of hard, cracked-handed labour that woman's linens demanded of you before any of the rest of it happened. You think about this question longer than any of the others, because it deserves an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. You tell her that you resented her, certainly, in the ordinary way any servant resents the comfortable ease of the person she serves, resented the fine cambric and the endless changes of linen, and the 7 years of lye burns that woman's laundry cost your own 2 hands. But you tell her too that resentment and the particular loyalty that grew in you over those same years were never actually opposites, any more than fear and duty were opposites. You could resent the unfairness of her life and still find yourself at the end unable to let a small folded scrap of her final grief be swept away with the ordinary rubbish of a ransacked cell. Both things were true. Both things are still true, sitting here with you all these years later. You tell her the truth, which is that you were frightened almost every single day of those years, frightened in the linen room and frightened on the tower stairs, and frightened most of all in that conciergerie corridor, with a stranger's rough hands going through your basket while 2 small stolen truths sat hidden against your skin. But you tell her too that fear and duty are not opposites, that you can be entirely afraid and still put one foot in front of the other, still fold the next sheet, still climb the next flight of stairs, because the work in front of you does not stop needing to be done simply because your hands are shaking while you do it. That is the whole of what you have to leave her, really, more than any locket or letter ever was, not a story about a queen, a story about hands that kept working, quietly, invisibly, through the worst thing any of them had ever lived through, because somebody has to fold the linen, somebody has to carry the basket, somebody has to notice the small folded thing half hidden under the straw that everyone else in the room is too busy or too frightened or too indifferent to see. Centuries will pass, and they already have. The palace where you first learned to iron a queen's chemise now stands open to strangers who pay a few coins to walk through rooms, rebuilt and restored long after the originals burned in a fire you never lived to see. The tower that held a family's final months together was torn down entirely within your own lifetime, the stones scattered. The ground it stood on turned eventually into an ordinary square, where children play and nobody thinks twice about what the earth beneath their feet once held. The prison by the river still stands damp as ever, though its cells now hold nothing but the quiet weight of memory and the occasional curious visitor reading a plaque. But somewhere, in an archive you will never see, in a private collection you will never be told the address of, a small painted miniature of a child's face still exists, and perhaps, if the centuries have been kind to it in ways they were not kind to the family it depicts, a few faded and fragile lines of unfinished handwriting still exist beside it, kept safe not because a laundress was brave, particularly, or important particularly, but because she simply could not make her hands put down a small folded truth that everyone else in the building that day was too busy to notice. The human heart does not change, whatever else the centuries take apart and rebuild. The need to protect a small true thing from a world determined to trample it flat, that does not change either. So let it come, this rest you have earned after such a long, strange telling. Let the tower crumble in your mind the way it crumbled in fact. Let the crowd's roar fade into ordinary evening quiet. Let your hands, which have done enough work for tonight, finally lie still. Let the lye and the starch and the damp stone smell all soften into something gentler now, something closer to memory than to feeling, the way all sharp things eventually go soft if you carry them long enough and gently enough. You have carried enough for tonight. Let it rest with you a little longer, and then let it rest without you, the way all long carried things eventually must. Let the linen room go quiet. Let the boiling coppers cool. Let the last basket be set down, unopened, until morning. Let the tower's cold stone warm just this once, just for you, into something closer to shelter than to prison. Let the crowd's roar become, at last, nothing more than the ordinary sound of a city breathing in its sleep. Tomorrow there will be more washing. Tomorrow there will be more mending, more folding, more small quiet work waiting exactly where you left it. But that's tomorrow. Right now there is only this. The last candle guttering, the last thread pulled through, the last basket carried up the last flight of stairs, the same as it always was, the same as it will be again, the same as all the long nights stretching out behind you and ahead of you both. Some things don't change. Hands still ache after a long day's work. A mother still reaches for her children, even from behind a locked door, even when there's no more time left to finish the letter. The need for rest at the end of it all, that never changes either. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way it once took a tired laundress at the end of a hard century. Hands finally still, heart finally quiet, the whole weight of everything she carried finally, gently, set down. Good night.